How I Got Here, the inside stories of startups and innovation in travel and transportation, with your hosts, PhocusWire's Kevin May and Mozio's David Litwak.
Hello there, very good day to you all. Welcome to another episode of How I Got Here. These are PhocusWire and Mozio's inside stories around innovation and startups, travel and transportation. We're delighted for this episode to be joined by Wen-Wen Lam. She's the CEO and co-founder of NexTravel, based in California. It's a Y Combinator startup focused on the business travel sector. It creates tools for companies to book and manage their travel and lots of other things that we'll get into this episode. The company has so far raised 4.7 million over 2 rounds. The most recent one was 2.4 million, which was announced a couple of weeks ago, but was actually signed off in September of last year. So a very warm welcome, Wen-Wen. Thank you for joining us on How I Got Here.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Okay, no bother at all. As always, with every single episode of this podcast, we always ask you, each guest, if they could tell us briefly, how did you get here?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that people don't talk about that much is that, people very rarely start out with the idea that they originally conceived. And so one of the things that really played into how we got here is we started this whole thing as a consumer travel company that was very similar to an Airbnb for trips. And, the business model for that entire thing is just really difficult, and it's a very hard idea to execute. And so one of the things that me and my co-founder did initially was we took our backgrounds, our respective backgrounds, to see what we could do to make the business work. So while we were doing the pivot, we actually talked to over 100 companies to see what they actually wanted in the travel space. So this was 2014. We actually incorporated early 2013, and we had just been tinkering around with the idea of doing something without any flights or hotels. We wanted to create travel experiences, and I think a lot of travel companies, but we actually sat down and spoke to companies. They all had the same issues, and they were all saying, like, the tools that we have today are completely inadequate. And so once we were able to kind of figure out what they wanted, we were able to kind of build bit by bit and kind of get to a launch in 2015. And we actually got into YC with the current iteration of what we're doing now. Obviously, we've developed the company quite a bit since then, but prior to that, we were literally looking at doing the exact opposite. I think one of the things that really made it possible for us to be able to do this actually was my enterprise sales background and my partners, my co-founders' gaming background, because we were able to kind of test a bunch of stuff early on to make sure that we actually were getting it right on the product market fit part.
Okay, thank you very much, Wen-Wen. I mean, that's quite a long kind of history of the company there. I'd like to kind of go right back, because you said it started off as something very different. So what gave you the inspiration for that idea? And it sounds like, certainly with the speed of the way you've just talked us through it, did you come to the realization that a consumer play and a pivot to what NexTravel is now, did that happen fairly quickly?
It took probably about a year, to be honest. I think you always kind of hang on to that first idea because you're like, man, I really love this. And I think loving to travel and building a business around loving to travel are two completely different things. So one of the things that we really were tinkering with at that time, we were putting up all these landing pages with get cool experiences for tickets to, go to the zoo or something like that, or go to exclusive restaurants or nightclubs. And I've seen lots of businesses try to do this. But ultimately we were finding that we were spending a lot of money just testing things, and we weren't really getting conversions. And that's kind of what prompted us to get to a point where we needed to pivot. At the pivot time, we literally tried on 4 or 5 different ideas. Some of them were actually not even close to travel at all. So we were looking at, custom made tailoring clothing and stuff like that. So it took us quite a while to get to the pivot. And so the build out of it took about 6 months once we got there, but it takes a lot of time to gather the data and to see what's actually a viable idea.
So just on that then, when you decide, it's interesting that you said that, you had the original idea and you were, I guess in a way it's like, it's like your baby, isn't it? You're very keen to hang on to it because it was the first thing that you came up with. But you said you went through a couple of other ideas, some which weren't related to travel. What was it that gave you the kind of the eureka moment, if we can call it that a business travel startup is the direction that you should take your company?
Well, there were a couple things. And the first thing was that I already knew how to sell to businesses. So I was pretty early at LinkedIn. And so as a result, we had to essentially find product market fit when I was there as well, because we didn't have anything to monetize when I was at LinkedIn. It was mostly looked at as a quote unquote business consumer platform. And so I think that was one piece of it, because I already knew how to sell into businesses. And I also thought that the market was more attractive, because instead of, you've got a very low margin business with travel where you're making $1, $2, $3 off every transaction, right? And so in order to really build a business, you really have to look at it and say, how can I get a whole chunk of travel at the same time? And the only way I could really think of doing that was to selling something to businesses. I didn't know what specifically, but I knew that it was something in that vertical.
And interestingly, I mean, business travel is such a well-defined kind of part of the industry and has lots of structure and disciplines to it. When you when you were seizing on this opportunity, okay, this is the way we're going to go, right? Come on, this is the way. Who did you kind of draw any inspiration from in terms of other companies that were in the space? Did you look at other younger businesses, startups, or did you look at the giant, dare we say, dinosaurs of the travel management company world? I mean, who did you look to for inspiration?
So we actually were looking at all of the big dinosaurs and realizing that they weren't filling the needs of the customers. So I wouldn't call it necessarily inspiration, but we just spoke to so many people that were like, we don't want to be using a brick and mortar travel agent. And that was the biggest thing. And then, people were using, at that point, Agencia wasn't too big yet, but everyone, like universally, was using Concur and saying, I hate this. So that was the biggest kind of takeaway, because when you find like people that are, relatively young companies that are willing to switch to, at that point, we were a 4-person startup. That's when you would pretty much know that you've hit something, you've hit the chord there. And we saw a lot of that, really in the first 2 years, because we were the first ones who really got into this market. I mean, I would say that we had customers before, really any of the new startups out there, and a lot of them actually pivoted into where we were because they saw that it was working.
Yeah.
Quick follow-up. You said enterprise a bunch of times. Are you talking about really big enterprise or mid-market or SMBs? What are you, just to clarify quickly before I ask a follow-up question?
Mid-market and SMBs is our primary focus. I think most companies are mid-market in terms of their travel spend. So that's even like the really big companies. I think there's probably 500, 1,000 that spend a ton, and they have completely different needs. So we don't try to go there.
So that's kind of colors my next question. So I feel like everyone kind of hates, Salesforce, Concur, these massive companies but I think of like Cvent too. And, they are what they are though, because they satisfy a bunch of different criteria. And how did you really think about slicing that market up? And it sounds like one of those answers is don't focus on the, Deloitte's, McKinsey's, and Citibanks of the world. But I'm just curious how you approach that problem, thinking about which part of the market you were going to focus on and which features you were going to launch specifically, so you didn't get bogged down and become one of those kind of massive, tangles of a company.
So we actually really had a really bottoms up approach, to be honest, because I don't think there are some differences in what a bigger company needs, but it's not as crazy, because even a really big company, and you'll notice this, sometimes won't even have a managed travel program. So once in a while, you'll come across a company that's spending like $10 million a year. That's just like, we book everything on Travelocity. And you realize then that like really like the real MVP is the ability to be able to book the travel, right? And then to have the receipt. So those are just the core functional pieces. But everything else around that, I think because we were very much similar to like how Dropbox kind of approached it versus like a box, right? From a bottoms up approach, we realized that there was like issues that individual travelers were having themselves. Like we do have people that have their own companies and they're like one person and they still use us because of some of the functionality that we built in. And so we took the bottoms up approach, definitely. And then as we grew, we started building in more enterprise-y features.
And to clarify, when you say Box versus Dropbox, you're referring to how Box started with the enterprise and was more thinking about enterprise use
Yep.
cases, where like Dropbox started with users wanting to sync certain things together. Is that the analogy?
Exactly.
Cool. Well, so could you expand a little more how you view the TMC OBT world? Because you are, you're looking at building basically kind of a joint platform, if I'm not mistaken, or do you have agents, or tell us a little bit about where you straddle those two worlds?
Sure thing. So we did realize that a lot of mid-market companies did not want to be sitting around picking out an OBT and then a TMC also. And I think that just to call out like someone who did that really well was Agencia, was to put everything in one package. And so we were playing on that trend for sure. That was definitely something that was super key that a lot of people didn't want to do. And we realized that customers really didn't care about the intricacies of those things unless they were saving like tens of millions of dollars, because the savings just aren't there for you as a small company. And so we don't think of ourselves as a TMC or an OBT. We think of ourselves as a travel company.
What Wen-Wen, what difficulties did you face at all as a kind of a young business trying to get into the business travel game? When was it around contracting with supply partners such as airlines or hotels? I mean, did you find any of that particularly difficult, or did you have a process that you went through?
It was actually really difficult to get our first supplier on board. So like none of the TMCs wanted to work with us at all. They all wanted to see some sort of volume first. And at some point I went to this business conference. It's called GBTA. And I literally talked to, I think 50 people and I got one supplier out of it. And had it not been for that supplier, their Atlas Travel, we would not have been able to get the business off the ground. Just straight up, it was not going to be possible. So back then there was a lot of resistance to tools like ours.
And why is that? Well, give us a sense of what the resistance was.
It largely disrupts their business, right? Because we're saying, hey, everybody should be booking stuff online. And, you know, in 2013, I think I was looking at the stats for my first test. I think something like 50% of people were still booking things via agent, if not more. It could have been 70. I don't remember anymore, but some high percentage. And now it's moved, you know, a lot towards, you know, people booking things really largely online during businesses because and during work hours. And it's because, you know, nobody really wants to pick up the phone and call an agent if they don't have to. But the technology tools were just built, you know, in a way to push everything to an agency back in the day, because, you know, travel agents existed way before the internet.
Yeah, tell me, it's interesting. You said if you hadn't have got that first customer, that first supplier, then things might have been very, very different. But once you did have that supplier, was that almost like a domino effect, and it kind of came along very quickly behind them?
Well, we didn't need other suppliers after that, really, because but what you really do need is just the ability to issue a plane ticket. And, you know, the demand was always there largely. So we always had people that wanted something like this. And, you know, today, even when I'm building this business, I see some kind of things that kind of spring off the side of our business that people like universally want that nobody has built yet. So for sure, the demand is there. The supply side is more of the restriction.
Very cool. So to clarify, you basically actually went to kind of a pseudo competitor, Atlas Travel's another TMC, and basically agreed to let them be your ticketing backend. Is that correct?
Correct.
Cool. Well, so I wanted to like steer the conversation to the other side of the kind of difficulty closing partners. So you said that it was pretty easy. There was always demand, and I think that actually stands out to me a little bit, because I think most people who do enterprise sales into big companies, or even mid-tier companies, are often very annoyed by trying to pitch into corporate. So I don't know if you have a magic touch, but that's actually, you mentioned a enterprise sales background at LinkedIn, and I think Mozio, we've pitched a lot of corporates over the years, and we've kind of gained certain insights. If you could think of what are some of those insights you've had about how to close these guys? Is there I know some of the simplest ones, of course, build relationships, stuff like that, but is there a true insight you've had about how to approach people in corporate travel, and how to break through for these people who are weighing duty of care and cost and convenience and all these different things in one?
So we did start with a smaller customer size, as I had mentioned, but the other big piece of it is we literally spoke to so many customers. So instead of like speaking to them and selling to them what existed, we were listening to them. And the overwhelming thing that we realized is, things are changing largely from a, admin-centric view to a user-centric view. So really, the end user starts to matter a lot more. So the worst thing for a travel manager is to have, 10 people yelling at them because everything got screwed up. And of course, everything's on their head and they're worried about getting fired. And so that's kind of why Concur was the default option, because you were never going to get fired for getting Concur. And then the next level above that is you're not going to get fired for choosing that tool, but then everybody is complaining to you all the time. I mean, I'm sure you guys have seen like the tweets and, like the, public stuff, but I mean, people really, really dislike Concur's travel tool. It's a very much kind of hated type of thing. So, and what happened with, the growth of all these technology companies is that, and the job market really, is that it became more important to make the end user happy and not just the admin finance person. So it became very important that employees were actually happier with internal tools. And you can even see that in a bunch of other places as well. Like, there were a bunch of ATSs that popped up, applicant tracking systems that were geared towards creating a better process for hiring so that companies could put their best foot forward and things like that.
So yeah, that reminds me kind of how someone joked, no one is ever fired for hiring Bain, and it's the same type of thing. And so could you elaborate a little bit more on how do you get past that, though? Because inevitably these companies do have heads of procurement, and is what you're saying is a natural trend that as more people were booking their own travel, like just the pendulum swung in the other direction, or did you or did you have a philosophy of how you approach these travel procurement managers to basically say, I know we're new, but take a risk on us because of XYZ?
Well, there were two things that we did. We started with smaller customers. So our first 2 years was very much like SMB. So our biggest customer, I think that first year was probably spending like $1 million a year. And so like, if you look at that, you learn and you're able to build out your feature set for that. But once you get like your first big-ish customer, then you get your second like big-ish customer. And then all of a sudden you have, 5 or 6 big-ish customers. And then you take that and then you turn that into, like 10 big-ish customers, right? And so it kind of start having this big ripple effect, because you can say, hey, Yelp is using us for travel. And the other piece is we looked at verticals where it'd be easier for us to kind of get in the market. So we were able to figure out that hiring departments, they didn't need procurement to sign into it. Like they just need their head of recruiting to come in and say, hey, we want to do this. And it's actually one of our popular products today. We have something called NexTravel Hire, where solely, hiring, like their head recruiter will come in and say, hey, let's just, do all of our hiring through NexTravel because they've built the correct product for it. And then there's a land and expand function there. And that's happened for us quite a few times as well.
That's really cool, actually. Now, I remember reading about that. So can you expand, maybe tell us a story about how you realized that, and did you stumble upon that? Did you have an intuition from the top that, you should go after recruiters, or did you just kind of see it one day that, oh, wow, people are using this for this use case?
Even small companies were using it. So I actually had a friend who was who had his own startup. He had like a 25-person startup, and he was actually using, our travel tool, trying to be a really great friend. But also he would ask me for these things. There are a couple companies that helped us do this early on. And it was called Cover. They were doing like a split payment thing. And they kept having to fly in candidates, like engineering candidates to New York. And so we realized then if a small company like that was doing that, we should try to market it to bigger companies. And that's kind of how that was born.
So, Wen-Wen, if you can talk us through a little bit about how you've gone about raising money. So, as we said in the intro, there's been 2 rounds, one in the last 6 months, announced a couple of weeks ago, but the previous one was in 2015, I believe, which is fairly soon after you pivoted and I guess relaunched as NexTravel as it is today. How did you go about getting that first round, given that you had just pivoted, or was that round gained on the back of planning to pivot?
So we did that first round out of YC, which is a completely different circumstance. We actually did a seed extension. Sorry, the stuff is not accurate on Crunchbase. Like about a year later of 1.1. So it was actually more like we raised one, we raised another one, and then we raised another two something. And, it was from existing investors. So the same investors put in the last 2 rounds, but they actually just saw the traction that we were having. And we've been very conservative about the fundraise because we are in this super low margin business, right? So really when it comes down to it, you've got to be pretty conscientious of how you build your business, because we are a technology company, but we still sometimes get put in the bucket of, travel agent. And so what you don't want to do is completely wipe out all your optionality, like early on. And that's kind of how we've approached it. The other thing is sometimes when you over raise, you spend a lot of money on stuff that you don't need. So it's forced us to be pretty disciplined as a company, and have a very strong focus on profitability from the get-go. So our unit economics have always been strong. Our growth has always been strong. We've just been very much, growing the company the way a company should kind of be growing.
And yeah, I mean, in that particular vein, then, when we've seen some other similar types of companies that are raising extraordinary amounts of money, and I just wondered, what has the conversation been with your investors around the money that you need? Is it going back to the point that you just made when about profitability and things like that you have raised, frankly, very modest amounts compared to a company like TripActions?
Yeah, I mean, they're pretty happy with it. I mean, they know that our ROIs are just high, given how much we've raised, just across the board compared to almost everybody. We're just doing a lot of business, but instead of doing it based off of, like fundraising, we're doing a lot of it based off actual revenues. And so that's kind of a nice thing, because then you keep a lot of control of your company. And then that way, when you do go out to raise bigger amounts, then you do get to keep control all the way through. So that's like the really positive piece of it.
So when we just interviewed Steve Hafner, who talked about how there were a bunch of other competitors to Kayak, like Mobissimo and Sidestep, and how one of the main things, the reason they won, other than good execution, of course, was his skill as a fundraiser. And clearly that's not the case in your segment of the industry. I think business also is a little more defensible than consumer. So I would love to hear a little bit more about how you decided that you didn't have to kind of participate in that fundraising rat race compared to other companies that do.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think right off the gate, we had a pretty smart strategy on the distribution side. So we were able to keep our customer acquisition costs relatively low. So Expensify was one of our first investors, so we were able to take advantage of that almost from the get-go. And that was like a huge boost for us, because I think a strategic, in this business specifically, a strategic partner is pretty important. And if you look at somebody like Concur and American Express, it did a lot for them versus some of their other competitors. And as I had mentioned, we've seen people in our space specifically raise, $500 million or more. Reorder and Commerce did that, and they were, unable to kind of compete with Concur over time despite their raise. And I think it really just came down to strategy and execution. So I think that's the kind of the main thing that you've got to keep an eye on, is look at your business, look at the unit economics, and then how do you get there, and try to raise responsibly, right? And raise when you need to. And, I think that's the best thing that you can do.
So it's great that you mentioned Reardon Commerce. Reardon Commerce's new name is Deem, and I know quite a lot about them because they have a huge ground transportation product that Mozio works with. But the reason why this is relevant is that the reason why they have a ground transportation product, and they were just acquired by Enterprise, is because part of their business model was, as a new OBT, was they were planning on giving away and not charging any fees for flights and hotel bookings, and trying to make money off, this is the legend at least, I think this is true, it's been confirmed a couple times, they were going to try to make money off of things like ground transportation and insurance and everything other than flights and hotels. It's my way of segueing into, I hear that you guys do not charge booking fees either, but you charge for integration. And so could you illuminate a little bit what your business model is, and is that a strategic advantage?
Yeah, so I think that our business model, we make money both sides actually. And one of the things that we don't charge for a transaction fee, but what we do is we do a licensing fee. So companies are willing to pay for the software. And then on top of that, obviously we make money off hotels like every other travel company, right? So I think that to kind of, if you go pure OBT, that business model just isn't going to work for you, because it's just not a good business. It's really, really hard to do, even at crazy volume, because it's $2 a transaction, and good technology is expensive to build, right? So that's kind of how you ended up with all of this really bad technology on the Concur side, because they weren't making any money off of it, versus Expense, where they were making a ton of money off of it. And so I think that you could try to do what Deem did, but I don't quite think it worked as well as they thought it did. So you really got to figure out how to have it all. Exactly.
No, yeah, I mean, I think you're completely right. And what's a good lesson to kind of circle back on, actually, for a lot of our listeners are startup founders. You get a lot of pressure from investors to go raise that $500 million in this case, and it's not always the smart idea. And especially, I remember Mozio got all this pressure to raise a lot of money, and we basically said, if I have an extra $3 million, I wouldn't be doing anything different than I'm doing right now. And that was kind of how we decided to not raise more. So I think your restraint is admirable. But over to you, Kevin.
Yeah. Can you talk to us a little bit about, how does the company expand from here? How do you see it? Is it just more customers in the kind of the region that you're in, North America, or do you have designs on other parts of the world? Because we've talked a bit about Trip Actions and the vast sums of money that they've raised, but here in Europe, where I'm based, Travel Perk is raising lots of money. There's Travel Stop in the Far East that's not raised as much money, but is equally as ambitious as everybody else, including yourself. How do you view expansion and growth, either geographically or organically, within your own region?
So I think that for us, it's best to focus on the U.S. market. I would say that the playground is kind of set here, and we know who we compete with on a very regular basis, and we have our different strengths and weaknesses, but we're pretty solid. There's a lot of infrastructure stuff that needs to get built to service a global market, and I believe that Travel Perk is actually the best position to do that, because they're having to build out different things than just an agency, right? They're having to build out a bunch of different point of sales. They're having to build out every single region. And so that's an infrastructure play versus a SaaS play almost. So I don't know if that's what they're doing, by the way, but I would guess with $100 million, that's why they've raised that.
Okay. And I mean, how does that, are you happy to be almost like a service company of them do all that infrastructure building for you almost, or am I reading it the wrong way?
I just don't think that it's good to defocus too much into a place where you don't execute, right? So one of the key things where businesses do fail is they lose their focus. And so in order to like build a good business, you've got to focus day in, day out on doing what you do super well versus, you know, expanding too much, and it's hurt a bunch of businesses to do that, especially like as a young company. And so that's kind of the answer that I give. And I think that from the get-go, their focus just may have been different, right?
Yeah.
Because they know that they're in Europe. They know they have to service Spain and London and France and stuff like that. But the US market is just so big that if you don't have to do it, why would you?
And tell us, you know, 4 or 5 years in now, I mean, what would you say has surprised you about the market that you eventually ended up in after the pivot and the decision making that you needed to do? Is there anything that you've thought, well, I didn't expect that to happen?
You know, I didn't expect the supply side to be so difficult. I thought it would always be the demand side, just as you guys thought. But like that was not the reality. The reality was that the supply side was always intensely more difficult than the demand side for us. So I know it sounds backwards, but it seems like, you know, at least back in the day, we were more gated by, you know, the airlines and hotels. And even today, I would say that would maybe still hold relatively true.
Yeah. And last of all, I think it would be useful to kind of get your thoughts. You were a founder in the mid to late 2000s of an organization called Women 2.0. And I just wondered if I just wondered if you could kind of talk us through that. What was the idea behind it? What did you achieve, first of all? And then I'll come back with a second part question.
Okay, yeah. So we did start Women 2.0 pretty early on. It was almost by accident. It was an organization for women because at that point, there weren't very many women in tech at all. Yeah. And like specifically, not very many women starting companies, not very many women even getting into management level positions. And, you know, there's a lot of talk about it today, but we kind of just wanted to create a community of people that could actually talk about it. Because I was very early on in my career. And so we literally just wanted to build a community where people could start thinking about it. I mean, I remember we started this thing called the Napkin Business Challenge, where people would write their ideas and we would go raise like a really small amount of money just so that somebody could like have, you know, $10,000 or $50,000 to start something and get in front of a bunch of VCs. Early on, because there's also very little education that was something that like women could do. And, you know, even I would say, even when I started this company, it was really only just starting to heat up, like this whole notion of women being able to raise a lot of venture capital, right?
Yep.
And so it's way further along today. But I think if we hadn't kind of started bringing a lot of awareness to it back then, you know, it may have never happened. And that's what we did. We literally started it like, you know, in our living rooms, right? With me and Shai and Angie and such. And we threw events at my San Francisco apartment. And, you know, we met a lot of really great people through all of that, but it was really, really like grassroots at that time.
So tell us, Wen-Wen, I mean, what experience have you had, if any, with, we've had a couple of guests on How I Got Here, female entrepreneurs who've frankly had some problems with raising money. They've been met with a degree of resistance, or maybe resistance is the wrong word, but downright bias is perhaps a better word, because they were female founders. Is that something that you've experienced or not?
So one of the things that I noticed the most wasn't that I wasn't able to raise money. And I think my investors are really awesome, to be honest. But I think it was more about like the valuation and the amount. And so like that was a really interesting takeaway, because it makes you build your business very differently, right? If you've got a ton of money and you've just got to like burn through, you know, a ton of money on marketing, you build it differently than like a business with super strong unit economics. And so I would say that things have changed in that women can raise money if they have a good business, right? And they can tell the story, and they need to learn how to sell themselves better. I would say one of the things that women do poorly is maybe sell themselves super well. And I myself am like, you know, a victim of that as well. But I would also say that it's now possible for women to raise money, but they can't expect the valuations unless they've hit like the correct chord. And I would say that that's changing today, though. Like, I mean, you see the Away co-founders like raise a big round.
Yeah.
You've seen like guys like Birchbox come out, and so as like there become more and more wins, then you'll see more and more women be able to raise more and more money. And like one of the things that I'm super focused on actually is, instead of like, you know, particularly if in this case, maybe I don't build a multi-billion-dollar unicorn, but what I'm building for is a win. And in my book, right, a company that is like on its way to profitability, that's processing hundreds of millions of dollars every year, which we certainly are at this point, is like getting into that kind of vertical of, hey, we're you know, becoming winners. And by not raising too much money and by producing some sort of win, it's going to make it easier for women to do it in the next generation. In the next generation, it was actually one of my goals, starting Women 2.0 and actually this company as well.
It's something that you'd like to resurrect in terms of creating another organization, but for those in travel. I say this because my sister company Focuswire is very interested in this area. I just wondered if you feel that there is a need for an organization like that to be created again.
I think that there's supports that generally support systems are really good for this type of thing. So I'm often at tables where it's only men. And I'm really lucky that I have tons of mentors that have done great companies. But like I said, they're mostly men, and that's fine. But it is helpful if there's a sense of sisterhood if women are doing the same thing. So I don't know necessarily if we need another organization, but you know, some sort of structure where you can get mentorship and advice and all that kind of stuff.
Okay, thank you, Wen-Wen. David?
Well, very cool. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast, Wen-Wen. This has been How I Got Here, Mozio and FocusWire's podcast about innovation in travel and transportation. See you next week.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the How I Got Here podcast. We'll be back next week with more insight stories behind startups and innovation in travel and transportation. Check mozio.com/move for a complete write-up of the highlights of every podcast with translations into 5 languages, and get your daily dose of news on the digital travel economy by subscribing to the newsletter at focuswire.com. See you next week.